finishing up with Napoleon III and going on to the Paris Commune and various conflicts within and without France. So last time we noted that Napoleon Bonaparte, the Napoleon that we all know about, had his administration institute a number of educational reforms, including the baccalaureate, still the name for the French high school leaving examination. Closing down, I didn't talk about this, closing down a lot of the provincial universities that had really fallen into disarray. And we'll probably say some more about the problems of French universities later on. But we did say that in 1852, finally, we got universal education in France, but the church schools dominated. And it was in 1882, what are called the Ferry laws, that we get the requirement that schools be secular. And in 1905, we have the institution of laïcité, secularism, which is still an issue in France in terms of how does France deal with its Muslim population in particular. We also mentioned the revolutions of 1848. There was a slide we saw about the throne room of Louis Philippe being taken over by the mob, and the revolutions of 1848 spread all over Europe. It's another one of those, the joke goes, a turning point where history failed to turn. But we do have in France the development of nationalism, and we talked a bit about the notion of peasants into Frenchmen. Here's one of the books that's very well known, if you're interested in that issue, by Eugen Weber, The Modernization of Rural France. We mentioned the Franco-Prussian War, and we'll say more about that in a few minutes. And France loses the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. You see there, right there on the map, they're sitting here on the border of Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Switzerland. We also noted that Napoleon III started some imperial ventures and continued to try to maintain the hold over Algeria, which is something that in 2022 is still a sore point between the two countries of Algeria and France. Here is just some of the stuff you see from put on the internet. Over 800,000 people considered to have died between 1830 and 1871. And these are images of some of those people. I saw that picture last week. And finally, this comedic picture of settlers in Algeria. It's not as though they're all high-class people marching in their uniforms. These are farmers who actually grab a hold of Muslim-held land. And we talked about the early movement into Indochina, which, as you're probably aware, became a full-scale war after 1945. And the United States took over that war after 1954, leading to what was really a national trauma for us, the war in Vietnam. Well, let me start with the Paris Commune of 1871, which has become really an image for the left of great things that have happened in the past. So we have the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, and it's generally thought that Bismarck, the chancellor of what was then Prussia and became the German Empire, sort of maneuvered Napoleon III into declaring war. It's a short war. The French got clobbered pretty fast. And as a result, we have the establishment of what's called the Third Republic. The Third Republic lasts from 1871 to 1939, 1940. And the people, there are a lot of people in Paris who say, we don't like what you've done, and we don't like the surrender to the Germans. And we've set up this locally run government for several months in Paris. And here's a cartoon of the time knocking Napoleon the First off his pedestal. All right, then, you dirty bugger, we're going to knock you down just like your crummy nephew, meaning Napoleon III. So in Paris, there is a strong anti-Napoleon III, and in this case, Napoleon I feeling. And they set up the National Guard, which is the local militia, who refused to accept the surrender to Germany. And they seized control of the city, and the French, based in Versailles, French government, refuses to acknowledge that this is a legitimate government and that Paris is put under siege by French army. That is, the Germans are not involved here. And here you have an image of wagons protecting the guns of people in Paris. And there is another image of a dethroning. I think that's Napoleon I being dethroned. And the government has been called feminist, socialist, communist, anarchist. You have lots of strong-willed groups emerging in Paris of the time. And they called for a separation of church and state. Remember, we saw those laws in 1850 where the church takes over the schools. The Catholic Church is really still very important in France. The commune has self-policing. They remit rent. They try to abolish child labor. They talk about the rights of employees to take over abandoned enterprises. And they lose. 1871 in May, the bloody week where the army comes in and they executed, who knows how many? They say 10 to 15,000 communards. Other estimates, 30,000 people were executed. 13,500 communards are found guilty on trials, and many flee abroad. In 1880, they get pardoned, but this is 1871. It's a pretty nasty time of reprisals against the commune in Paris. And if you recall, when we talked about who settled Algeria, some of those people were refugees from the commune. Here is Paris burning. It's claimed, it isn't clear what happened, that the communards would prefer to burn down the city rather than give up. And here we have a gruesome picture of communards who had been executed. Well, how is the commune punished? We saw all those trials. We had that forced emigration and people kicked out of Paris. So until the 20th century, the suburbs around Paris are considered, quote, red, that is, voting communist. It was the only commune not allowed to have a mayor. And that was rectified in 1976. So this is this tradition. Here you have up until the 1960s. This is Paris in here. And here are these suburbs that vote communist. That declined after the 1960s, but the historical memory and the population centers remained strong until then. This is 1870 to 1960s. Parliament in the Third Republic is dominated by monarchists, but they can't agree with one another. Otherwise, you might have had a restitution of a kingdom. So they did force communards out of the city. Here you have in Versailles, the old site of the throne of Louis XIV, but Versailles is still there. The palace is still there. Many of you probably have visited as tourists. But here's the Third Republic being born by these various statesmen. The parliament still has lots of monarchists. The Catholic Church says, don't change anything. Here you have this infamous papal syllabus of errors in 1864 that condemns rationalism, freedom of speech, religious toleration, socialism, what's called the cult of science. It institutes what's called papal infallibility, which is something that is misunderstood, but certainly becomes a target of anti-Catholic feeling. Misunderstood in the sense that the Pope is infallible only speaking ex cathedra, that is in an official capacity, but here is presumably the Pope speaking to the crowd, proclaiming this syllabus of errors. The problem with the Third Republic is that because of the splits, the leadership is really weak. In the first 29 years, from 1871 to 1900, there are 6 presidents, 4 resigned, 1 was assassinated, and 1 died in office. And here is the assassination in 1894 of Sadi Carnot, the president. It was an ugly time. You know, when we think republic, we abroad think of something that has democratic representatives, people agreeing on moving forward in many ways. There was a stalemate in the Third Republic. But by 1900, the Republic was well established. Some of the established powers were challenged in the late 1890s by what is called the Dreyfus Affair, and we will talk about that a little later. But here, I wanted to note the legend and heritage of the Commune. The Commune fell after 3 months, and lots of people were punished. Friedrich Engels, of late, this social democratic Philistine has once more been filled with wholesome terror at the words, dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen, do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. And what Engels is getting at is lots of democratic reforms, what are considered democratic, and rule by, quote, the people. Here is 1924. The Soviet Union greets the Paris Commune. So, you know, this image continues. At the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, here's the image. To those who died in the Commune, May 21st, to the 28th, I wrote the 18th, May 21st to the 28th in 1871. And a wall, piece of graffiti, Vive la Commune, long live the Commune. From the other side, here is a image of the communards as pyromaniacs. Remember, there was that fire, and it's entitled The Crazy Activities During the Commune. There's a 2014 book where the reviewer says, attention on the enormity of the moral outrage perpetrated by a modern state and a supposedly civilized society against its own citizens. And what he's talking about is the reprisals of all those murders and people being exiled. In Mr. Merriman's retelling, the Paris Commune is a reminder that the worst villainies are possible once you have dehumanized your opponent. So you have atrocities on both sides. Massacres by the communards of its enemies, and then massacres of the communards by the French who come back in. Let's move on, because France has some real issues in the second half of the 19th century. From 1795 to 1866, it's seen as the second most populous country in Europe. It grows from 28 million to 36 million people, but there are real problems for the French. Here you see this image that I have here, army draftees rejected for being too short. And then in the dotted areas are the worst areas, but even the dark green ones, you have large numbers of people being rejected as too short. And we consider too short being a sign of malnutrition or poor nutrition. And you see how it's all over the country, you see this issue. And the demographic transition in France. Remember, I mentioned last week the notion of the demographic transition is the decline of birth and death rates. The problem is that for many countries, the death rate drops more quickly than the birth rate, and you get, well, that's a problem, but a huge increase in population. But here, public health in France is not necessarily better in France than it is in its colonies. It's just a real issue. France has a slow rate of urbanization, much slower than any other European country. Now, is urbanization necessarily good? Not necessarily, but given the 19th century in terms of opportunities for employment, in terms of public health, in terms of schooling and so on, it is good. And France becomes a country of immigration because it's not growing internally. The peasants are very resistant to change. So I like to play just a little bit of a video to give some idea of what's going on in France.
France is one of Europe's and one of the world's most
I don't hear any sound, Larry. Maybe it's my computer.
No, I don't hear anything either. I don't,
I'm not hearing anything either.
I don't hear anything either.
Okay. We'll move on. I think we once learned that that's an issue. Essentially, what that video is saying is that the center of France is really depopulated. It has many small areas that are declining, villages, little towns, losing population. And this is a real issue in France. I'm sorry you can't hear that video, but it's an issue that we've had before with Zoom, and I have to work on that. So let's move on. We have this Peasants into Frenchmen, and that's the book I mentioned. And we have a contrast between the city and the countryside. In a Balzac novel, he says, you don't need to go to America to see savages. Here in the countryside of Burgundy are the redskins of Fenimore Cooper. I mean, this is his image of the people in the countryside. You're hearing me now, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So from Bordeaux in the south to Bayonne, there's a wilderness. There are various descriptions of peasants in the first half of the 19th century. This is an urban descriptions: ignorance, superstition, dirty, lazy, greedy, avaricious, suspicious. I don't know what I mean here by fountains. Rags, miserable savagery. The fear of wolves in the countryside is very common. So here we have this image of the French peasantry, this peasant woman gathering twigs for firewood. And we have here a more realistic image of what peasant dress was like. They're really very poor. And you see this man on the left is not in good shape. And this woman on the right probably is wearing perhaps the only clothes she owns. It's really a very difficult situation in the countryside. You have the concept of national unity coming out of the revolution of 1789, but it doesn't quite get to the countryside. That's what that previous video was about. And adversity became, in the eyes of the urban people, imperfection. So Napoleon III does try to do something about it, that is his administration. You have improved agriculture, improved health, increased literacy, the end of periodic food crises. If you have read about the French Revolution of 1789, a lot of it started with bread riots. On the other hand, not everybody speaks French. There are many languages, and it's those 1882 laws which first demand that the kids learn to speak French. It's a funny situation. And here you have problems in the countryside, people just moving, losing their property. It's a very difficult society. And once again, here are people working in the fields, backbreaking manual labor. Well, while this is going on, France becomes, from the urban point of view, an imperial power. And this over here on the upper right is the way that editorial cartoonists are looking at these various countries grasping to hold on to parts of the world, the biggest one being John Bull, Britain. But here's France right here, Russia over here, Germany over here, Russia presumably here, and the French soldiers marching in, taking over wherever they're going. And there are various quotations as to what imperialism is and why it becomes so important for France. This is Anglo-Saxon, but we have to remember that it is part of our responsibility and heritage to take care that the world shall receive the Anglo-Saxon and not another character. So the British are the big rivals of the French. Imperialism is necessary to preserve the existing social order in the more developed countries. This is critics of imperialism. Investors who put their money in foreign lands desire to use their resources of their government to minimize these risks. This is the economic side of it.
Back to sleep.
You're on TV.
Oh, terrific.
Please mute yourself, please. Whoever is talking. Another criticism: imperialism is objectless expansion, a pattern similarly learned from the behavior of other nations. And finally, we have Lenin wrote a book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. So all of this stuff may or may, probably most of them refer to France as well. So we talked about the war in Algeria. I wanted to give you some ideas of what's going on in other areas where the French are involved in imperialism. At the same time as we get the Third Republic, which despite its internal conflicts is supposedly standing for democracy and parliamentary government. Morocco is treated differently from Algeria. As you know, Morocco is on the northern part of Africa. It's both on the Mediterranean coast here and in the Atlantic coast, as opposed to Algeria, which is all Mediterranean and has become, we talked about it, we'll talk about it again. Algeria is considered part of France. All these others are colonies. What they call Morocco is a protectorate. And what you see here is how the French gradually take over parts of Morocco. Here's 1907 to 12, also 7 to 12. And then these various shadings suggest how the French are expanding. And then in 1912, they declared a, quote, protectorate. There was even a clash with Germany. There's an infamous diplomatic crisis that is finally settled in French favor. But I'd like you to note, by the way, that here's this thing called Spanish Morocco. The Spaniards still hold two urban areas, Ceuta and Melilla, in northern Morocco today in 2022. They're still there. So, it's left over from this period. In World War I, you got 45,000 Moroccans enter the French army. The question is, why did they sign up? Most likely because they needed to support their families. They're terribly poor in Morocco. These people were from the rural areas, poor and illiterate. And after the war, there's a kind of a after the First World War, there's kind of a civil war among Moroccans. You have French soldiers, Foreign Legion, and Moroccan soldiers, and you have what's called a war between Moroccans. And interestingly enough, I'm sorry, I went too fast here. A lot of these soldiers, Moroccan soldiers, provide the source of Francisco Franco's army when he institutes a revolution in Spain in 1936. It's Franco and his Moroccan soldiers. The immigrants to Morocco are not just from France. They come from many Mediterranean countries, such as Italy, Spain, Malta, and they're Christian. They're mainly male. They mainly come from cities, and they have a sense of their own superiority. And you begin to get a French managerial class and a Moroccan unskilled labor class. So here is how the French are celebrating their soldiers, medals that were given out in 1909 for participating in the invasion of Morocco. After the First World War, benefit from Moroccan troops who were wounded in World War I. So the Moroccans become second-class citizens, but the French are happy to have them as soldiers. And the French and other Mediterraneans who come are involved in what's seen as deep racism against les indigènes. Indigènes are indigenous peoples. That's what they call them. Each country has a name that they use for countries for populations that they colonize. And you get a huge transfer of land. Large estates are set up and migration of people kicked off the land going to the cities. So you get development of urban centers in what was formerly a rural country. And here we have a Moroccan farmer in a field of barley. Remember that Morocco and Algeria are not deserts, at least not in the north. So that, there's a lot of agriculture going on. And what the French try to do is split the Arabs from the Berbers and other tribes. And you do get the emergence of a nationalist movement. Here's a 1930 revolt against the French. And the French Popular Front of the 1930s, that we'll talk about more in the next class, had limited freedoms allowed. They allowed a labor organization, which is unions, for example, but Europeans only, they recognized. They weren't interested in Moroccan independence. And the Spanish had that colonial interest. You saw on the map Spanish Morocco. Franco used Moroccan troops to invade Spain in 1936. In World War II, the Americans first went abroad in an invasion of Morocco. That's this whole North African campaign of 1942, 1943. It started in Morocco. That's a whole different story as to why Morocco was chosen, and I won't go into that, but that's what happened. And in 1955, Morocco achieved independence. So what's the French heritage in Morocco? It still has close ties with France. It speaks the same language as either a primary or a secondary language. Here you have an image of, in 2013, of President Francois Hollande greeting King Mohammed VI of Morocco. So it is a kingdom, and if you read newspaper reports, it's just a wonderful, somewhat conservative but peaceful country. That's what you read in the newspapers. That's what the Moroccan press, foreign press would like you to believe. On the other hand, Mohammed VI is reportedly one of the richest men in the world, with a reputation for corruption and political repression. He has what's called the Royal Holding Company, and going from bottom right, insurance, agriculture, mines, distribution of goods, and television. It's all owned by this holding company where Mohammed VI is the major shareholder. Here's a book that came out, The Predatory King, A Heavy Hand on Morocco. And there's a record that the Moroccans spent a lot of money trying to prevent the publication of this book. But I just give you some of this as saying, is this the result of French control? Not necessarily, but the French did set up a system where certain elites controlled and still control the country. They used to be French, now they are Arab and some Berbers. There are other areas in Africa that also become the object of French imperialism. There is what's called the scramble for Africa. It starts with, the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. So you may know Greece became independent in 1830, and the Balkans, Serbia, de facto independence, 1817, Romania and Bulgaria. So we're not going to talk about the Balkans here. But in Africa, Egypt breaks away from the Ottoman Empire, and there's a kind of a ruler who's supposedly subservient to the Ottoman Empire, but he's not, Muhammad Ali, who really sets the stage for an attempt at an independent Egypt. But we'll see that the British and the French are not so interested in having an independent Egypt. Here's a picture of the famous Muhammad Ali. In North Africa, we also have this invasion by France in Algeria, Morocco, and I don't know if you knew, Madagascar, a French colony. Here are French troops landing in Madagascar in 1895. So they're all over the place. Here are two maps. On the left, 1880, where the colors refer to where Europeans are involved. And in 1913, this blue, that's French. It's Algeria's here, Morocco's here, Mauritania, a whole bunch of different what are now independent African countries, Equatorial Guinea, Madagascar down here, the islands. And then there are other countries who are involved For example, Portugal in green, the British in orange. So Africa is carved up by imperial countries. France is not the only one, but France is very much involved. So why West Africa? If you want a book that will give you a minute-by-minute description, you can try this book. It's useful for reference. It'd be hard to read straight through. The Scramble for Africa by Thomas Buckingham. And here's this image of Les Colonies Françaises, the French colonies, and on the shield of Marianne, who is the symbol of France, you see progress, civilization, and commerce. That's what France says it's bringing along. And here you have in Africa a French army officer getting the locals to sign treaties that gives the French certain powers while working through the local nobles. Well, nobles, funny word, local leaders. And here is another image supposedly of celebrating the French coming into Africa. And once again, the French really celebrate what's going on. Francophonie, meaning people who speak French, has remained as the primary or secondary language of former French colonies in Africa. And I just wanted to show you this to see how crucial this has become. Here's 1913. We just saw this map, French West Africa. And here are the countries that are carved out of that. Now, we're not going to go one by one, but you can go down. They're listed alphabetically. They refer to these areas here, mainly West Africa, a few in other places. And they get independence, mainly in the 1960s. France gives independence to these countries. But what's striking to me as well is the growth in population. You know, we have in 1960 about 65 million people. In 2021, approximately 317 million people in these formerly independent former colonies. And this is a suggestion that there's a terrible problem in all of Africa because feeding these people makes it very difficult. When I saw these numbers, I myself was astounded. So it's something that we probably are still concerned about in how do you help these countries if you want to help them. Population growth is not something easily controlled. Just to take, we're talking about Morocco. 11.5 million people when it got independence, and today they have almost 37 million people. And Algeria from almost 11 million to 45 million. These are very large countries. You know, when we talk about countries in Europe, many of them are rather small compared to this. All the Balkan countries and even something like Poland and possibly Ukraine have fewer people than these big ones here. What's so special about Egypt, where the British and the French really clashed? You know, Muhammad Ali was essentially independent, as we said, but cotton became important, using steam engines for harvesting. And there's something called long staple cotton, which is a synonym for luxury. And in the 1860s, the US Civil War cut off American cotton from Britain. And now you have Britain, and followed by France, even more concerned with controlling the cotton trade from Egypt. Unfortunately, since then, it has declined. Egyptian cotton is not too great anymore, but there is a picture of loading cotton in Alexandria, the British port on the Mediterranean. And but today they're still doing a lot of this stuff by hand. There's a man, he's twirling the washed and dried cotton into threads. You see him holding his foot out to hold the threads out from him. In the 1840s, you have something which were reminiscent to me of the 10 plagues, an economic crisis, cattle moraine, flooding, locusts, and there were people who attempted to avoid military conscription by blinding their sons in one eye. I mean, it was pretty bad in the 1840s. In the 1850s, the French tried to use this misery to expand their influence. And some of you may know the name Ferdinand de Lesseps, forms a financial company to what he says, to pierce the isthmus, that is, to build the Suez Canal. And then you have the ruler Ismail the Magnificent, who was really extravagant, drove the country into bankruptcy, and you have the British occupation of Egypt, which really upsets the French. The French had built the Suez Canal. The labor was what's corvée means forced labor. That's what was going on. In 1882, the British Army took over. First, the British and the French controlled the finances, and then the French made a decision not to get involved. In 1882, there was people thought that Britain and France were going to go to war over colonies. When they were down in Sudan, 1898, there's this big showdown at the town of Fashoda. The British want to build a railroad, Cape Town to Cairo, and the French want to go Dakar to Somaliland, which is east-west. Dakar is, as you know, the capital of Senegal in West Africa, and Djibouti, which was then in Somaliland, is on the east coast of Africa. And here we have the French seeing how wonderful they were in establishing their colonies. Commandant Marchand leading the French troops across Africa. The French army is, quote, disgraced in the late 1890s. And the Dreyfus affair, again, we'll talk about that next week, adds to the disrepute that some people have regarding the French army. But the French are upset over the British control of colonies, and you have continuing conflict. I mean, down to 1945, after the Second World War, you still have a clash of France and Britain over Syria. In Nigeria, there was a threat of civil war in the 1970s, where the province of Biafra was looking to secede from Nigeria. Nigeria is mainly English-speaking, and one of the few places in West Africa that was English-speaking. And the French sort of send their help to Biafra. It was pretty hairy at the time, including famine. This was one of the results of that Biafran war, horrible results. You probably remember the Rwandan Civil War of 1990 to 94 and the Rwandan genocide. François Mitterrand, the French president, has been accused of favoring the people carrying out this genocide. You can't prove that, but there was certainly a French tilt to support those powers. My point here is that the French may not be the official rulers of all those countries in French Africa, but they are very influential there. If you look at the French newspapers, you get headlines about what's going on in Mali, whereas the American newspapers, put it on page 13 in a little box. It's headlines in France. Here are a picture of horrible things that happened in Rwanda, as you know, slaughter of one tribe by another. Sort of hard to talk about Algeria as Africa as a whole. So you're really going section by section. But why Algeria? Charles X in the 1830s, 20s and 30s dreamed of establishing an absolute monarchy. And then Napoleon III in the 1850s says, I am as much the emperor of the Arabs as of the French. In 1871, the army finally gives up control. You see them in this picture where this terrible war of the 1830s and 40s, which even dragged on afterwards. And from after the First World War, the colonists, whom then and now are called the Blackfeet, Quinois. It was a term popularized in the 1960s as the, quote, French colonizers. Remember that they're not necessarily French in ancestry, but they all speak French, and they identify themselves with the French government as opposed to Arabs and Muslims. You know, so this whole notion of the French being critical of Muslims long precedes the current fear of Muslim immigration. Just to take a look here at this map to remind you where things are, here's this Algeria is a pretty large country. And so you have Algeria, here's Morocco, and then these are all former French, well, Libya was Italian, these French colonies down here. Algeria has a revolt in 1871 against the French. Mokrani is a leader there. About 250 tribes got together, taking over a third of the country at first. You know, this is the most, more moderate temperatures, more habitable up here. There's the Sahara down here. But there was this revolt. And then in the, after this had followed a drought, cold winters, cholera, and earthquake. I mean, things were pretty tough in Algeria. And the French government responds by giving the colonists more advantages. And you have the creditors demanding repayment. There's this revolt, perhaps 150,000 people in Kabylie, which is up in here, participating in the revolt. The region then pays a huge collective fine, and an enormous number of hectares of land are confiscated, given to settlers, and many of those settlers come from Alsace-Lorraine. Remember 1871, the Germans took over Alsace-Lorraine. 100,000 people choose to stick with France somehow, but where do they go? A lot of them go to North Africa, Algeria. And we have leaders of this revolt are exiled to New Caledonia. Now, New Caledonia, you ask, where's that? It's in the Pacific, a group of islands. And it's still, New Caledonia in 2022 still has an issue with French control. And we'll see that. There have been a number, at least 3 referenda in the last 25 years to see whether New Caledonia should be independent of France. And the French keep winning and the locals keep shouting that it's fixed. It's still going on. In Algeria, we have something called the Crémieux Decree. Adolphe de Crémieux was a French minister, and Algerian Jews, only in the northern parts, were made French citizens. Muslims, in order to become citizens, had to renounce the religious control over certain personal items like marriage, divorce, and so on. And so although the Jews celebrated this, in the long term, this created a lot of resentment between Jews and Muslims in Algeria, lasts to the present. After 1948, you have a large emigration of Algerian Jews to Israel. Now, this is something that I may have to show next week because you told me that you can't get sound. But it's a video to try to talk about the French in Indochina. And I will work on getting sound for that. But this picture is gruesome. His heads cut off of the people who are opposed to the colonists. It's not just the French army. They have allies locally. But that was, Indochina. And so now we've gone from West Africa to Indochina, and France is attempting to control large parts of the world, second only to the British. We have this, that was the problem of sound.
Yeah.
But here we have why Indochina, and here's where we're going to end this discussion today of the imperialism. Why Indochina? It still concerns us today. Indochina was not one country. You have Tonkin in the north, which is the core of what became North Vietnam. Annam, and what's called Cochin China in the south. We have Laos landlocked here. Cambodia, these are now independent countries. They border Thailand, or what was called Siam. And if you recall, we talked about Napoleon III had these dreams of grandeur. And under the Third Republic, the French continued that. They may have given up on Napoleon. They did not give up on this idea of expansion in Indochina. There was some conflict with what was then Siam. But why did they want it? They started with rice. They went to rubber. They built roads and railroads to help them export this stuff. But these projects give opportunity for tremendous corruption. And the French settlers do very well with that. It became the world's second largest exporter of rice. And who owned the big farms? Guess who? The French colonists. And then they have the attempt of this, what we noted before, the civilizing mission, French language, French history, and so on. And they tried to divide the locals from their traditional culture. If you recall, last week I gave a quote about how some of those Vietnamese intellectuals felt themselves being divided from their own culture. At the same time, you're getting inducements to Frenchmen to colonize the country. And they clash with local culture. For example, here's some examples. What's different? The French say that once you're 21, you have achieved your majority. That is, you are free. Whereas in the local culture, there's a lack of respect to an older family member is really very bad. Again, the Indo-Chinese did not like to use legal names because they considered it disrespectful to their ancestors. The French, on the other hand, said you don't have to have legal names. I mean, these don't seem like major items in themselves, but they are. They're indications of that clash with the local culture that build. I mean, there are lots of other things that happen. I just give you these two examples. At the same time, the Indo-Chinese, who had a certain tradition of literacy from the time they were ruled by the Chinese, have a serious decline in literacy because they're kept out of the schools. So what you get in Indochina is slim pickings for the locals, but lots of riches for colonists who come in and they use, their control to control agriculture and then whatever else is going on. After 1945, the French Empire collapses, as you should be aware, and we will talk about a little bit next week about the US entanglement in Vietnam. We're not going to have a course on Vietnam, but it will say about how the French got stuck there and the US came to their aid and remained long after the French were there. So I regret that we weren't able to